There was just really great potential. It could have gone hideously wrong, like any movie could, but I always felt that this one could go even more hideously wrong than most when you're dealing with, dragons. But after speaking with Rob, he just really nailed how it would work.
I wanted actors who could play the characters and not just be stars on the screen, that I wanted the story to be the star. It's the way you present the creature, it's the way you present the characters and the circumstances. It's very strict adherence to the tone, which is realism, and knowing that the audience is saying, okay, I know dragons don't exist, but that's what set me off on Reign of Fire, and I thought, okay, monster movie, B-movie, make realistic world where the people are living and dying in a world that is controlled by dragons. If they don't believe it's real, they won't really be scared.
My problem with the portrayals of dragons in films, you always take it on face value of they're a magical, mythical creature and they breathe fire. But no one ever's been like, let's go a bit deeper into this. Do you just accept that they're just magical, giant flying lizard that's able to breathe fire and move on? But there's one film that goes deeper into the biological side behind the way they breathe fire, and that's, in my opinion, the severely underrated Reign of Fire.
So everything would hang from his shoulders like a hornet, and we ended up with a look that was a lot meaner. The things that communicate that are purely shape. So we look for torn shapes in the wings, always trying to show the spikes on the wings and this torn membrane look.
Every bone, every muscle, every gland, every toenail, it's basically building an animal.
Do you know what? You're so right, because there's an element depending on which fantasy film you're looking at. Like Narnia, the dragons in that, or any of the creatures in that, I don't think there would be anything, even if you ask C.S. Lewis himself, to explain the mechanism between how anything works. You don't really ask how's the magic coming out of the wizard's staff. But say like Lord of the Rings, there's a load of magic and shit in Lord of the Rings, of course, but there's also a real world physics that you kind of can believe. The orcs and elves are like, to an extent, magical beings, or a magical species that have supernatural elements to them that humans don't possess. There might be an actual different organ system going on inside them. The trolls look physically like they're a species that could exist, and I imagine the dragon in the Lord of the Rings probably have some sort of organ system that could be explained, that Tolkien maybe never wrote down, but he's probably thought about at one point, of how they're able to breathe fire. But it's always a sense that it's a fantasy film. It's literally in a magical alternative universe, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be explained. But Reign of Fire isn't a fantasy film. It's grounded and gritty and meant to be in the real world. And how can you have dragons in the real world without explaining how they could have evolved, how they could actually work to fly, to breathe fire, and all these things that, on the face of it, compared to any other animal we're aware of in existence today, couldn't be possible. Has to be supernatural.
Smaug would be a good example. His fire is immense, but it's unexplained. There's no hint of like biological limits or mechanisms. He's more of a magical entity rather than a living creature. And another example, the movie Dragonheart from 1996.
Oh, how did I forget that? I remember that was the first film I remember going to the cinema and seeing.
So it kind of goes a bit deeper. So Draco's fire in Dragonheart is tied to his mystical heart. So again, it sort of goes into the way that he can breathe fire, but again, it's leaned a lot on fantasy rather than the biological element.
It's interesting though, when it is a magical element to it, you don't usually get an explanation to that extent. It'd be weird if Gandalf suddenly turned around and explained, how I light up my staff. It's almost weirder to explain magic than to not.
The plot of Reign of Fire is set in a post-apocalyptic world where dragons have wiped out most of humanity. Obviously, there's remnants, so there's Christian Bale stars in it, and they've all retreated underground.
Christian Bale does tend to survive in the apocalypse.
Matthew McConaughey turns up later and they're like, oh no, it's Americans. It's like a specialist commando unit of American soldiers who jump out of helicopters to try and kill the dragons, and their shelf life is like 17 seconds.
Fucking badass scene in their dive suits and like zooming down towards the dragons. But they sucked. They were shit. They got the shit beat out of them straight away. But to be fair, that is because every area of the planet is dealing with their own dragons, but they're dealing with the one one male dragon, the one that can fertilize all the eggs. The classic archetype in these sort of films where there's one particular member of this species that if you kill, you essentially wipe them all out.
And that kind of like mirrors real world species like bees, where a queen obviously dominates the reproduction. The portrayal of dragons in Reign of Fire, they're not just monsters, they're part of a bigger ecosystem.
So did they ever explain why they were able to be in sort of a state of permanent hibernation?
So Christian Bale as a youngster, there's a flashback 20 years and for some reason he is allowed to go onto the sites where they're clearly like mining. There's loads of gruff Geordie miners when he's going down to see his mum who's in charge of the mining site. He's a small kid and they're saying, oh, we need you to go through this hole to check this thing, which they allow him to do, by the way. He goes through to a like further cavern and he's like touching the walls, but you're watching it and you're like, hang on, I can hear breathing and the walls look like they're moving, and obviously all of a sudden you see a roar and the wall is a huge dragon and it just wipes out the whole mining with its immense fire. And I just thought, what a cool opening, man.
When I took this movie on, I started doing research about what dragons meant to different countries and was surprised to see the number of countries that all have their own dragon lore or mythology, and they're all different. Dragons represent something that is supreme.
It frames a dragon as more of a giant lizard with wings that feeds on ash. It seems to get some sort of nutrients from the ash that it's eating to survive. And again, I found that really cool because I did genuinely think to myself once in my head, what would dragons eat? So I found that really cool that they're doing.
Do you know what? That is so interesting because I've never thought about what a dragon would eat. I just assume it doesn't need to eat anything because it's magical, or it just eats whatever the fuck comes its way, you know, a cow or a human, whatever. But that's so interesting as well because you think it had to have come from so long ago, hundreds of millions of years, that whatever bizarre branch in evolution it comes from died off completely, because how it can sustain itself is so far removed from anything on the planet today. The idea that something could consume ash first of all and get its nutrients from it and get everything it needs to live, but it's also insane because it adds another reason to why it has this biological mechanism for breathing fire. You know, mouth is basically a flamethrower because it's not just a defense thing. It's almost like it can cultivate the land the way we farm land to become a food source. But instead of farming it and helping things grow, it just incinerates everything in its path.
It incinerates everything in its path for its like immune system, so it's constantly like on a survival regen, which I thought was pretty cool. Like,
it's also kind of fucked up though, because if the normal animals we deal with today are renewable resources, you know, they're solar panels, then these things are fossil fuels, because life currently, it consumes but also gives back. Everything goes back into the land, you know, its body deteriorates and goes into insects and the ground and back into plants and then back through into animals and herbivores again and then back through into carnivores again. There's a give and take about everything, whereas these things go through and scorch everything. So every time they consume something, that's just scorched earth, that's done, out of the equation of the biosphere. So the only inevitable end game is that the entire earth is turned to ash and these things start cannibalizing each other, which is what we get. It's an absurd biological element, but the fact that it's trying to explore how dragons could be real animals, they came up with all these interesting concepts.
We used approximately 8 tons of liquid propane, as well as several thousand gallons of diesel, if you include second unit. We actually burnt diesel fuel on the set in through the Dante machines to create that black smoke look. Fire is an interesting element because you never know how people are going to react to fire. We had the entire vineyard burning. The farmers were running back to their Jeep. We used the Dragon's Breath apparatus. It was a spectacular shot. I think Rob was very happy with it.
To add on to the interesting concepts, Reign of Fire tries to explain a plausible way that the dragons can actually breathe fire. Now, you said about them having a flamethrower mouth. They produce fire through a chemical reaction. They secrete 2 chemicals from glands in their mouth. Now, you might think, oh, that's a bit crazy, that's a bit far-fetched. They're saying like they have like napalm within their mouth. Apparently there's a beetle called a bombardier beetle that does a similar thing, and it sprays out burning, scalding chemicals. So maybe they've looked at that, Declan, the writers of the film, and been like, oh, that bombardier beetle's really cool. Like, maybe we can get that and just put it up a level to dragons.
I guarantee they must have looked at loads of animals. I suppose they had the internet back then, or if it was a little bit slow and you were still on dial-up, they could have got out the Encyclopedias Britannicas and just looked at all the weirdest, strangest animals, or maybe even the Guinness Book of Records. That would have been a good one, because I'm pretty sure I've seen that beetle in one of my annual Christmas Day issues of Guinness Book of Records. So yeah, again, really cool way of taking something that does exist in the real world, notching it up to 11 and using it as the basis for how something that is only found in supernatural mythology could be in the real world. It's not just a case of showing how this biologically could have been an animal, but you kind of got to find a place for it within Earth's natural history. And one touch I really liked was the fact that they figure out that they've evolved around 66 million years ago, and what came just a million years later, but the death of the dinosaurs. So in this version of reality, it wasn't a big old meteor hitting into the side of what would later become North America, but was actually due to the dragons, who seemingly wiped out basically all life on Earth, including the dinosaurs, and went into hibernation.
Dragons wiping out dinosaurs wasn't on my list ever, and when I saw that in the film, I thought, do you know what, that's cool as hell.
Another cool concept that relates back to the fact that by the nature of how the dragons consume ash, so they breathe fire to destroy everything, to create the ash, they end up with absolutely nothing else virtually alive on the planet. So it's built in that they kind of have a hibernation clock, kind of like how a grizzly bear goes to sleep every year for a few months, but on a almost cosmic scale. They'll go to sleep for tens of millions of years. You know, they maybe came around at the end of the dinosaurs, but maybe that was just the latest in their hibernation cycles, where they woke up, went about their business for a few million years. The Earth dried up and said, oh, okay, fuck it, let's go back to sleep for 40 or 50, 60 million years, or to weather some little kid breaking basic child labour laws and health and safety rules stumbles upon us and wakes us up.
I'd be like, just my luck that it's the 10 million years the fuckers are awake rather than asleep. You'd be fuming. Obviously, the food would be pretty shit because all they've got is an allotment with a couple of carrots. So I'd be fuming about that as well. But, you know, you make do with what you got in a Dragon Age apocalypse. I thought the defense mechanisms they had against the dragons when a fort they've built was attacked was pretty basic. They just had giant harpoon guns that Matthew McConaughey somehow, in a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, managed to hit one of the dragons and kill him from about 500 yards away, which was an impossible shot.
I also liked how the glands that the dragon has, like you said, to produce the fire is also kind of like a self-destruct button, or it's one main weakness where if you ignite it just at the right point before the dragons produce the second or third chemical, then you blow it to pieces.
But imagine the speed in which the dragon is flying. To get the shot must be impossible, but he is an American super soldier.
He is. He is a badass motherfucker.
I can understand why people get pissed off with the film. There is a lot of like weak elements to it, but it stands alone in dragon cinema for giving us a biological, plausible dragon creature, the dragon's ecological role in the world around it, the grounded design of the dragon, because it wasn't like a giant skyscraper dragons that have loads of fairy dust protruding from them as they fly around. Out of all the various dragon incarnations I've seen in films, if dragons did attack, I would point to Reign of Fire and be like, that is the most realistic of all of them. It's not just a popcorn flick, it's more of like a love letter to science nerds who want their monsters to make sense rather than just kids' storybooks. Yes, it has its weaknesses, but I think it's got to be commended for that.